The day I switched coffee cups with my sister-in-law and watched her collapse from the poison meant for me, I didn't scream, I didn't panic. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Because what my husband Kellen and his partner Indira didn't know was that I'd been documenting their attempts to kill me for 8 months, and I had been waiting for this exact moment to catch them red-handed. My name is Zephyr Beaumont. I'm a cybersecurity expert, and this is the story of how I used my technical skills to expose the most sophisticated inheritance fraud scheme I've ever encountered. One that was targeting me and dozens of other Black families across Atlanta. If you've ever felt like someone was playing a game you didn't know you were in, hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about trust, preparation, and revenge forever. The morning it all came crashing down started like any other family brunch at Indira's house in Buckhead. Kellen was being unusually attentive, insisting I try the special Ethiopian coffee he'd supposedly learned to brew just for me. The smell hit me immediately, metallic, wrong, exactly like the tea that had sent me to the emergency room 3 months earlier. But here's what they didn't know. I hadn't just been getting sick from their attempts to poison me. I had been building the most comprehensive digital evidence file that would eventually send both of them to prison for attempted murder. Let me back up and tell you who I am, because understanding my background is crucial to understanding how I survived what was essentially an 8-month assassination attempt disguised as a marriage. I'm Zephyr Beaumont, and until last year, I was just another cybersecurity consultant in Atlanta, specializing in protecting small businesses from digital threats. I wasn't rich, I wasn't particularly well-connected, and most people, including my own husband, consistently underestimated what I was capable of. That all changed when my grandmother Esther passed away and left me her property in the sweet Auburn district. Now, this wasn't just any property. This was a 3-story Victorian that had served as a safe house during the Underground Railroad, complete with hidden passages and a basement that had sheltered freedom seekers for decades. What I initially thought was just a sentimental inheritance turned out to be worth over $4 million, thanks to Atlanta's aggressive gentrification of historically Black neighborhoods. Kellen and I had been married for 4 years when Grandma Esther died. He was a real estate developer, charming, ambitious, and he'd swept me off my feet at a tech conference where I was presenting on digital fraud prevention. The irony of that isn't lost on me now. Indira was my former college roommate from Spelman, the one who'd introduced us, always perfectly put together, always making me feel like I was the awkward tech nerd who got lucky landing a guy like Kellen. Here's what I need you to understand about my personality. I notice patterns. It's literally what I do for a living. When someone's trying to hack a system, they leave digital footprints, behavioral patterns, anomalies that most people miss. So when I started getting mysteriously sick after family gatherings, when elderly relatives began showing signs of premature dementia, when property developers started calling me with unsolicited offers on Grandma's house, my professional instincts kicked in. But I made a crucial decision that probably saved my life. Instead of confronting anyone directly, I decided to treat this like a cybersecurity investigation. I would gather evidence first, understand the full scope of the threat, and only act when I had ironclad proof of what was happening. If you've ever felt underestimated by people who should have your back, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because what happened next will show you exactly why preparation beats desperation every single time. The first time I knew something was wrong was actually 6 weeks after Grandma Esther's funeral. Kellen had insisted we have dinner at Indira's house to celebrate my inheritance, which should have been my first red flag, because neither of them had ever seemed particularly excited about my good fortune before. I remember sitting in Indira's pristine dining room, looking at the elaborate spread she'd prepared, feeling grateful for their support during what had been a difficult time. The meal was delicious, authentic Ethiopian food that Indira claimed she'd learned to make from a cookbook. About an hour after eating, I started feeling nauseous, dizzy, like the room was spinning. Kellen was immediately concerned, driving me to urgent care, holding my hand while the doctors ran tests. They couldn't find anything conclusive, said it might have been food poisoning or a stomach bug, and sent me home with instructions to stay hydrated and rest. What struck me as odd wasn't the illness itself, but Kellen's reaction afterward. He kept asking specific questions about my symptoms, how severe the nausea was, whether I'd experienced any neurological effects, almost like he was taking notes. And Indira, she was so apologetic it felt performative, offering to remake the entire meal to prove it wasn't the food, insisting we come back the following week so she could show me she was a safe cook. That's when my cybersecurity training kicked in. In digital forensics, we have a saying, once is an incident, twice is a pattern, 3 times is an attack. So I started documenting everything. Not just the symptoms, but the circumstances, the people present, the timeline, even the specific foods I'd eaten. I created an encrypted digital file on a secure server that neither Kellen nor Indira knew existed, and I started treating my own life like a system under attack. The second incident happened 3 weeks later. This time it was tea at Indira's house during what she called a girls' afternoon to discuss my plans for renovating Grandma's property. Same symptoms, same mysterious onset, same trip to urgent care with inconclusive results. But this time, I noticed something crucial. Indira never finished her own tea. She kept getting distracted by phone calls, letting her cup sit untouched while encouraging me to drink mine. That night, I installed keyloggers on all my devices and started monitoring my own digital footprint. If someone was targeting me, they might be gathering intelligence through my technology. What I found made my blood run cold. Someone had been accessing my email account, my banking information, even my medical records, but they were good, almost good enough to avoid detection. The third incident was the breakfast meeting 6 weeks later, supposedly to discuss Kellen's idea for turning part of Grandma's property into luxury condos. This time I was prepared. I wore a smartwatch that monitored my heart rate and blood oxygen. I had a recording app running on my phone, and I'd taken photos of everything I ate. When the symptoms hit, they were more severe than before, severe enough that I ended up hospitalized overnight. That's when I knew this wasn't random food poisoning. Someone was systematically poisoning me, and the escalation pattern suggested they were testing dosages, refining their approach. But what my would-be killers didn't know was that every incident was making me stronger, more prepared, more dangerous to their plans. The real breakthrough came when I was lying in that hospital bed, supposedly alone and vulnerable, and I heard Kellen on the phone in the hallway. He thought I was sleeping, thought the sedatives had knocked me out completely. But I was recording everything, and what he said changed the entire trajectory of my investigation. The dosage is still too low. She keeps recovering too quickly. We need something that will keep her incapacitated long enough for the property transfer to go through. But what Kellen didn't know was that this wasn't the first time I'd heard him discussing dosages and property transfers. Because for the past month, I'd been monitoring his communications, tracking his movements, and building a case that would eventually expose not just his attempts to murder me, but an entire network of inheritance fraud targeting Black families across the Southeast. Here's what I need you to understand about how a cybersecurity expert thinks when they realize they're under attack. Everything becomes data, every interaction becomes evidence, and every day you stay alive is another day to build an unbreakable case. The morning after that hospital stay, when Kellen was at work and Indira was presumably at her office, I began the most thorough digital investigation of my career, and the target was my own life. First, I needed to understand the scope of the threat. Using techniques I developed for corporate espionage cases, I started mapping all the connections between Kellen, Indira, and my recent health incidents. I created a secure virtual private network that masked my activities, then began systematically investigating their digital footprints. What I found was terrifying in its sophistication. Kellen had been researching inheritance laws for months before Grandma Esther died, specifically looking into scenarios where a spouse could claim rights to inherited property if the inheritor was incapacitated or deceased. Indira had been researching toxic substances that would mimic common medical conditions, visiting forums where people discussed untraceable poisons, even corresponding with someone who claimed to have experience in accident arrangement. But here's where their arrogance became their downfall. They assumed that because I was quiet, methodical, and generally trusting, I was also technologically naive. They were conducting their research on devices connected to networks I had administrative access to. Kellen was using our shared laptop for his legal research. Indira was using her work computer, which connected to a server I'd helped secure the previous year. They were essentially planning my murder on systems I could monitor in real time. The real breakthrough came when I discovered their communication pattern. They weren't just texting or calling each other. They were using an encrypted messaging app that they thought was secure. But I'd helped design the security audit for that particular app's parent company, and I knew its vulnerabilities. Within 48 hours, I had access to months of their conversations, and what I read made me realize this was bigger than just my inheritance. They had done this before, multiple times. There were references to the Birmingham widow, the Nashville Project, and the Savannah situation. Each case followed the same pattern. Identify a Black woman with valuable inherited property, establish a relationship or friendship, systematically poison her while arranging legal mechanisms to claim the property, then escalate until she was either incapacitated or dead. I wasn't their first victim. I was just their most recent target. That's when I made the decision that probably saved not just my life, but the lives of future victims. Instead of going to the police immediately, I was going to gather enough evidence to expose the entire network. I was going to let them continue their attempts to poison me, but I was going to control every aspect of the situation, document every crime, and build a case so comprehensive that no defense attorney could create reasonable doubt. I started with medical countermeasures. Using my knowledge of the substances they'd been researching, I began taking activated charcoal before every family gathering, prebiotics to strengthen my digestive system. And I even consulted with a toxicologist friend who helped me understand how to minimize the effects of the poisons they were using. I wasn't going to let them kill me, but I was going to let them think they were succeeding. Next, I established multiple evidence streams. I installed hidden cameras in my own home, positioned to capture Kellen's activities when he thought I wasn't watching. I set up audio recording devices that would automatically save to cloud storage. I created a dead man's switch on my computer that would automatically send all my evidence files to the FBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and several journalists if I didn't check in every 24 hours. The most crucial element was establishing legal protection for myself and the property. Working with an attorney they didn't know about, I created a trust that would prevent anyone from claiming my inheritance if something happened to me. I also established medical directives that would prevent Kellen from making healthcare decisions on my behalf if I became incapacitated. By the time I was ready to spring my trap, I had documented evidence of 12 separate poisoning attempts, intercepted communications proving premeditation, financial records showing they'd already been spending money they expected to inherit, and connections to at least 4 other victims in 3 different states. But what they didn't know was that their next attempt to poison me was going to be their last, because I was about to turn their own plan against them in the most satisfying way possible. If you're enjoying watching karma build itself into the perfect trap, smash that like button, because what happened next is the most beautiful example of preparation defeating desperation that I've ever witnessed. The morning of what I now call the coffee switch heard round the world, I woke up knowing that this was the day everything would change. For 8 months, I had been playing the role of the unsuspecting victim while systematically building a case that would destroy not just Kellen and Indira, but their entire inheritance fraud network. Today, I was going to flip the script so dramatically that they would never recover from the whiplash. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Indira had invited me for what she called a reconciliation brunch after I'd supposedly been distant following my last hospitalization. She'd insisted that Kellen come too, claiming she wanted to repair any damage to our relationships. What she didn't know was that I'd intercepted their planning messages, knew exactly what poison they were planning to use, and had already taken the medical countermeasures that would protect me even if something went wrong. I arrived at Indira's Buckhead home wearing a dress with hidden pockets containing 3 different recording devices, a smartwatch that was live streaming my vital signs to a secure server, and contact lenses with built-in cameras that would capture everything from my perspective. I looked like the same quiet, trusting Zephyr they'd been manipulating for months, but I was actually a walking surveillance operation. Kellen was already there, and the moment I saw his expression, I knew today was supposed to be the day I died. He had that same forced casual demeanor I'd seen before each previous poisoning attempt, but there was something different this time, something more determined. Later, I would learn from their intercepted messages that they were under pressure from their associates to complete the inheritance transfer quickly before I discovered their other victims. The coffee service was elaborate, almost ceremonial. Kellen had supposedly learned to brew traditional Ethiopian coffee, and he presented it with a flourish that would have been charming if I hadn't known it contained enough oleander toxins to cause cardiac arrest. Indira played her role perfectly, expressing admiration for his newfound barista skills while positioning herself to monitor my consumption. Here's where their psychological profiling of me became their fatal flaw. They assumed that because I was typically polite and accommodating, I would drink whatever was offered to me rather than risk seeming rude. They had based 8 months of murder attempts on the assumption that my southern manners would override my survival instincts. They could not have been more wrong. I accepted the coffee with appropriate gratitude, held it while we chatted about renovations to Grandma's property, and waited for the perfect moment to execute the switch. That moment came when Indira excused herself to take what she claimed was an important business call, but which I knew from monitoring her phone was actually a coded check-in with their contact at the medical examiner's office, someone who had been paid to ensure my death would be ruled accidental. When she returned, she seemed surprised that I hadn't finished my coffee, making pointed comments about how Kellen had worked so hard to perfect the recipe just for me. That's when I made my move, standing up abruptly and pretending to check my phone for work emergencies. In the confusion of explaining my supposed urgency, I deliberately stumbled near Indira's place setting, and in steadying myself, switched our coffee cups with a precision that would have made a professional magician proud. The beauty of the switch was that it looked completely accidental to Kellen, who was across the room, but my hidden cameras captured every detail for evidence purposes. When I sat back down, Indira was holding what had been my cup, and I was holding what had been hers. She had no idea that the poison meant for me was now in her hands, because she was too focused on monitoring my behavior to pay attention to her own coffee. What happened next was simultaneously the most terrifying and most satisfying moment of my entire life. Indira, completely confident in her plan, lifted the poisoned coffee to her lips and took a long, deliberate sip, her eyes fixed on me the entire time. I maintained eye contact, took a sip from her uncontaminated cup, and waited for the show to begin. The oleander toxin works quickly once it enters the bloodstream. Within minutes, Indira's confident expression changed to confusion, then concern, then outright panic as she realized something was terribly wrong. Her hands started trembling, her face went pale, and she looked at her coffee cup with the dawning horror of someone who finally understood they'd been outplayed. Kellen's reaction was even more revealing than Indira's physical distress. Instead of immediately calling for help or asking what was wrong, his first instinct was to look at my cup, then at Indira's, then at me with an expression of absolute terror. That's when I knew I had them both, because his reaction proved he knew exactly what was supposed to happen and to whom. "Call an ambulance," Indira gasped, but I was already dialing 911, my voice calm and professional as I reported the emergency. While I spoke to the dispatcher, I never stopped recording, capturing every word they said, every look they exchanged, every moment of their perfect plan falling apart in real time. The look on Kellen's face when he realized which cup Indira was drinking from was worth 8 months of being systematically poisoned. All that careful planning, all that meticulous documentation, all those nights lying awake wondering if I would survive their next attempt, it all led to this moment when the predators finally became the prey. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, but by then I had already captured the most damaging evidence of my entire investigation. As Indira's condition deteriorated and Kellen's panic escalated, they made the fatal mistake that sealed both their fates. They started talking. Not to me, not to the paramedics, but to each other in hushed, frantic whispers that my hidden recording devices captured with crystal clarity. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Kellen kept repeating, pacing the kitchen while the paramedics worked on Indira in the dining room. She switched the cups somehow, but how could she have known? Indira, even while connected to 4 fluids and oxygen, managed to gasp out the words that would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case: the dosage. "You said it would just look like a heart attack. You promised no one would be able to trace it." What they didn't realize was that their whispered conversation was happening less than 10 feet from where I sat. Apparently in shock, but actually operating 3 separate recording systems that were simultaneously uploading their confessions to secure cloud storage. Every word they spoke was building my case stronger, and they were too panicked to notice that the grieving, confused wife they expected to see was actually documenting their downfall in real time. The hospital scene was where their entire operation finally began to unravel publicly. Dr. Martinez, the emergency room physician, took one look at Indira's symptoms and immediately ordered a comprehensive toxicology screening. When I mentioned that we'd been drinking coffee together and asked if I should be concerned about my own health, he asked the question that opened the floodgates: "Has anyone in your family experienced unexplained illnesses recently?" That's when I played my first card. Instead of pretending ignorance, I pulled out my phone and showed Dr. Martinez the detailed medical journal I'd been keeping for 8 months, documenting every incident of food poisoning, every emergency room visit, every mysterious symptom that had brought me to various hospitals across Atlanta. His expression changed from professional concern to alarm as he realized he was looking at evidence of systematic poisoning. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said quietly, "I think we need to call the police." Kellen, who had been hovering anxiously nearby, immediately objected. "That seems extreme, doctor. Indira probably just had an allergic reaction to something. There's no need to involve law enforcement in a medical emergency." But Dr. Martinez was already on the phone with hospital security, and I was texting my attorney, Dr. Sarah Chen, who I'd kept on standby for exactly this moment. Within an hour, my hospital room had transformed into an impromptu evidence review session, with Detective Williams of the Atlanta Police Department's Major Crimes Unit examining months of documented proof that I'd been the target of a sophisticated murder plot. The moment Detective Williams saw my evidence files, everything changed. This wasn't just a domestic dispute or a case of suspected poisoning. This was organized crime with multiple victims across multiple states. She immediately contacted the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, and by evening, federal agents were interviewing me about what had become a multi-jurisdictional investigation into inheritance fraud and serial attempted murder. Kellen's behavior during the police interviews was a masterclass in suspicious responses. When Detective Williams asked him basic questions about our recent family gatherings, he couldn't keep his story straight about who had prepared what food, when we'd eaten, or why I'd been sick so frequently. When she asked about his knowledge of the substances found in Indira's system, he claimed complete ignorance, while simultaneously providing detailed explanations of how such substances might affect the human body. The breakthrough came when the FBI examined Kellen's and Indira's electronic devices. Using the same digital forensics techniques I'd employed in my private investigation, They uncovered the full scope of the inheritance fraud network. There were victims in Birmingham, Nashville, Savannah, and Charlotte. There were financial records showing payments to corrupt medical examiners, lawyers, and even funeral directors. There were communications with others involved in the scheme, including someone they called the coordinator, who apparently managed multiple inheritance fraud operations across the Southeast. But the most damaging evidence came from their own arrogance. They had kept detailed records of their activities, partly for operational purposes and partly because they were proud of their sophisticated approach. They had spreadsheets tracking my symptoms, dosage calculations for different poisons, timelines for property transfers, and even backup plans for disposing of my body if the poisoning approach didn't work quickly enough. The federal investigation moved quickly because I had done most of their work for them. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered was admissible, properly documented, and supported by multiple sources. Within 72 hours, they had arrest warrants for 12 people across 5 states, and they were uncovering new victims almost daily. The most satisfying moment came when FBI Special Agent Rodriguez showed me the financial records they'd recovered from the coordinator's files. This network had stolen over $40 million in inherited property from Black families over the past 5 years, using a combination of murder, fraud, and systematic intimidation. My case wasn't just going to put Kellen and Indira in prison, it was going to bring down an entire criminal organization that had been operating with impunity for years. As I sat in that FBI conference room, looking at evidence boards covered with photos of victims and suspects, I realized that my 8 months of quiet preparation had accomplished something much larger than just saving my own life. I had documented and exposed a genocide-level attack on Black generational wealth, and I had done it using nothing more than the analytical skills I'd developed as a cybersecurity professional and the determination to survive that my grandmother had instilled in me. The federal courthouse in Atlanta had never seen anything quite like the Beaumont inheritance fraud case, and I had never felt more prepared for anything in my entire life. After 8 months of being systematically poisoned, 6 months of federal investigation, and 3 months of pretrial preparation, I was finally going to face Kellen and Indira in open court, armed with evidence so comprehensive that their defense attorneys had already attempted to negotiate plea agreements 4 separate times. Walking into that courtroom, I felt the weight of every victim who hadn't survived their encounters with this network, every family that had lost their generational wealth to these predators, every moment I had spent documenting crimes while pretending to be their helpless target. This wasn't just about justice for me. This was about justice for every Black family whose inheritance had been stolen through systematic murder and fraud. Kellen looked smaller somehow, sitting at the defendant's table in his court-appointed attorney's ill-fitting suit. Gone was the confident real estate developer who had charmed me at that tech conference years ago, replaced by a man who clearly understood that his carefully constructed life was about to collapse entirely. Indira, still dealing with long-term effects from the oleander poisoning, appeared frail and bitter, shooting me looks of pure hatred whenever she thought the jury wasn't watching. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who had built her career prosecuting organized crime. She began by showing the jury a map of the Southeast with pins marking every known victim of the inheritance fraud network, then zoomed in on Atlanta to show the timeline of attempts on my life. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "you're about to hear how the defendant Zephyr Beaumont survived the most sophisticated assassination plot in Georgia's criminal history, not through luck, but through courage, intelligence, and the kind of methodical preparation that turned her would-be killers into their own worst enemies." The first week of testimony established the scope of the criminal network. FBI agents detailed how they had traced the organization's activities across multiple states, showing how Kellen and Indira were part of a larger conspiracy that specifically targeted Black women who had inherited valuable property. Medical examiners testified about the sophisticated poisons used, explaining how the substances were chosen specifically to mimic natural medical emergencies and avoid detection during routine autopsies. But the most powerful testimony came from other victims who had survived encounters with different members of the network. There was Patrice Johnson from Birmingham, whose husband had tried to poison her after she inherited her father's construction business. There was Dr. Angela Williams from Nashville, whose business partner had attempted to kill her for her grandmother's historic home. Each story followed the same pattern: trust, systematic poisoning, escalating attempts, and property theft. The second week was when my preparation truly paid off. I took the stand as the prosecution's star witness, and for 3 days, I methodically walked the jury through every piece of evidence I had gathered. I showed them my encrypted files, played my recorded conversations, demonstrated how I had monitored Kellen's and Indira's communications, and explained how I had turned their own technological overconfidence against them. The moment that seemed to shift the entire courtroom atmosphere was when I played the recording from the coffee switch morning, letting the jury hear Indira's voice saying, "The dosage, you said it would just look like a heart attack. You promised no one would be able to trace it." The silence in that courtroom was absolute as 12 jurors realized they were hearing a confession to attempted murder captured in real time. Kellen's defense attorney tried to paint me as a paranoid, controlling wife who had manufactured evidence to frame her innocent husband. He suggested that I had poisoned Indira myself as part of an elaborate revenge fantasy, that my cybersecurity skills had allowed me to fabricate digital evidence, that my supposed victimization was actually an elaborate con game designed to steal his client's freedom. That strategy backfired spectacularly when the prosecution presented their rebuttal evidence. They showed the jury financial records proving that Kellen had been researching inheritance law months before my grandmother died, that he had made payments to corrupt officials, that he had been in communication with other members of the network about techniques for accident arrangement. Most damaging was the evidence from his own computer showing he had researched the specific poisons found in my system and had visited websites discussing untraceable methods of murder. Indira's defense was even less effective. Her attorney argued that she was merely Kellen's unwitting accomplice, manipulated by a master criminal who had used her friendship with me to gain access to potential victims. But the prosecution destroyed that narrative by showing the jury her research history, her communications with other network members, and her own detailed notes about my reactions to different poisoning attempts. The climactic moment came during Indira's cross-examination by Prosecutor Walsh. When asked why she had continued to invite me to meals after I had been hospitalized multiple times, Indira finally lost her composure and screamed, because she kept surviving. We gave her enough poison to kill 3 people, and she kept getting up, kept going to work, kept acting like nothing was wrong. She was supposed to die, and instead she was building a case against us. The courtroom erupted. The judge had to gavel for order while Indira's attorney frantically tried to walk back her confession. But it was too late. The jury had heard her admit to deliberately poisoning me, admit to expecting me to die, admit to participating in a conspiracy that involved multiple attempted murders. When the verdicts were read 6 hours later, I felt a sense of vindication that went beyond personal satisfaction. Kellen, guilty on all counts, including attempted murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and inheritance fraud. Sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Indira, guilty on all counts, sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. 12 other network members across 5 states, all convicted, with sentences ranging from 20 years to life. But the moment that truly completed my transformation from victim to victor came when Judge Harrison addressed the court after the sentencing. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said, "your courage in documenting these crimes and your intelligence in gathering evidence has not only saved your own life, but has exposed a criminal network that might have continued killing for years. Your preparation and determination have prevented countless future victims from suffering the fate that was planned for you. As I walked out of that courthouse, I realized that my 8 months of quiet preparation had accomplished something I never could have imagined when I first suspected someone was trying to poison me. I hadn't just survived an assassination attempt, I had destroyed an entire criminal organization and potentially saved dozens of lives. The underestimated cybersecurity consultant had become the architect of one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in Georgia history. 2 years after the trial, I'm standing in the renovated parlor of my grandmother's Victorian home, now officially designated as a National Historic Landmark, looking at a room full of families whose lives were saved by the investigation that grew out of my own near-death experience. The Esther Beaumont Foundation for Inheritance Protection has become the leading organization in the Southeast for helping Black families protect their generational wealth from systematic theft. And every person in this room represents a victory against the kind of predators who nearly destroyed my life. The foundation wasn't something I had planned. It grew organically from the dozens of families who contacted me after the trial, seeking help with their own suspicious circumstances. We now maintain a network of cybersecurity experts, attorneys, medical professionals, and investigators who specialize in detecting and preventing inheritance fraud. We've prevented over 200 attempted thefts of family property, and we've helped recover more than $15 million in assets that had been stolen through various schemes. Kellen is serving life without parole at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he spends his days in protective custody because even convicted criminals have standards about men who poison their wives. According to my contacts in the federal prison system, he's become something of a cautionary tale among inmates about the dangers of underestimating quiet women. Indira is at the Federal Correctional Institution in Tallahassee, where she's apparently spent the past 2 years trying to convince anyone who will listen that she was the real victim in our story. The broader network we exposed has been completely dismantled. The coordinator, whose real name turned out to be Marcus Webb, a former insurance investigator from Jacksonville, received 3 consecutive life sentences for his role in organizing at least 47 murders disguised as accidents. The corrupt medical examiners, lawyers, and funeral directors who facilitated the fraud have all been convicted and sentenced. Most importantly, we've established protocols that make it much harder for similar networks to operate in the future. But the most satisfying aspect of my new life isn't the professional success or the public recognition. It's the personal transformation that came from surviving something designed to destroy me. I learned that I'm capable of patience I never knew I possessed, strategic thinking that goes far beyond cybersecurity work, and a level of courage that I had never been forced to access before. The woman who walked into Indira's house that morning 8 months into a systematic poisoning campaign was not the same woman who walked out with evidence that would topple a criminal empire. My relationship with trust has fundamentally changed, but not in the way you might expect. I don't trust less. I trust more strategically. I've learned to distinguish between the intuitive trust that comes from genuine connection and the blind trust that comes from wanting to believe the best about people. I trust my instincts completely now because they saved my life. I trust my preparation because it turned my would-be killers into my greatest evidence sources. And I trust my ability to survive whatever challenges come next, because I've already survived the worst that human beings can do to each other. The technical skills that allowed me to gather evidence have evolved into something much more powerful. I now consult with law enforcement agencies across the country on digital investigation techniques for domestic violence and fraud cases. I've testified before Congress about the vulnerability of inheritance systems to organized crime. I've helped develop new protocols for detecting systematic poisoning in medical settings. The expertise that was almost used against me has become my greatest asset in protecting others. Perhaps most importantly, I've learned something about the nature of quiet preparation that I never understood before my ordeal. Preparation isn't just about anticipating problems. It's about developing the kind of systematic thinking that turns problems into opportunities. Every attempt on my life became evidence for my case. Every lie they told became documentation of their guilt. Every moment they underestimated me became an advantage I could exploit. The property that started this entire nightmare has been transformed into something Grandma Esther would have been proud of. The main floor serves as the Foundation's headquarters, where we help families protect their inheritances and investigate suspicious circumstances. The second floor has been converted into a museum documenting the history of the Underground Railroad activities that took place in this house. The basement, with its hidden passages and secret rooms, now hosts educational programs about the historical and contemporary threats to Black generational wealth. Standing in this room today, surrounded by families who are still here because someone learned to recognize the patterns of inheritance fraud, I realized that my survival story has become something larger than personal revenge. It's become a blueprint for how preparation and intelligence can defeat even the most sophisticated criminal schemes. The young women who contact me through the Foundation often ask the same question: how do you get over the betrayal? How do you learn to trust again after discovering that the people closest to you are trying to kill you? My answer is always the same. You don't get over it, you get through it, and you use everything you learn to make sure it never happens to anyone else. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this: the people who underestimate you are giving you the greatest gift they possibly can. They're showing you exactly how much preparation time you have before they make their move. Kellen and Indira spent 8 months trying to kill me, never realizing that I was spending those same 8 months building the case that would destroy them. Their arrogance became my advantage, their overconfidence became my opportunity, and their assumption that I was helpless became the foundation of their downfall. Every time someone dismisses your capabilities, every time someone assumes you're not paying attention, every time someone thinks they can manipulate you because you're quiet or polite or accommodating, they're actually telling you exactly how to defeat them. They're revealing their blind spots, their weaknesses, their fundamental misunderstanding of who you really are. I want to end with something my grandmother used to tell me, something I didn't fully understand until I was lying in a hospital bed wondering if my own husband was trying to poison me. Zephyr, she would say, the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone thinks is harmless. She was talking about herself, about how she had used people's assumptions about quiet Black women to run Underground Railroad operations under the noses of slave catchers and sympathizers. She was teaching me that being underestimated isn't a weakness to overcome, it's a weapon to master. Today, as I look around this room full of families whose inheritances are safe, whose elderly relatives are protected, whose generational wealth will pass to the next generation as intended, I know that Grandma Esther's lesson has become my legacy. The inheritance she left me wasn't just property, it was the understanding that preparation, patience, and strategic thinking can overcome any threat, no matter how sophisticated or well-organized. The woman who switched those coffee cups 2 years ago wasn't acting on impulse or luck. She was executing a plan that had been 8 months in the making, using skills that had been developed over a lifetime, drawing on strength that had been passed down through generations of women who survived by being underestimated and emerging victorious. If you've stayed with me for this entire story, if you've watched karma build itself into the perfect trap, if you've seen how preparation can defeat desperation every single time, then you understand something important about the nature of power. Real power isn't loud or obvious or demanding. Real power is quiet, methodical, and absolutely unstoppable once it decides to move. To everyone who has ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or targeted by people who should have protected you, your quiet strength is not a weakness. Your careful preparation is not paranoia. Your refusal to be loud and dramatic about your capabilities is not a character flaw. These are your greatest assets, and the people who fail to recognize them are the people who will eventually learn just how costly that mistake can be. Subscribe for more stories of quiet revenge. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update, and remember, The most dangerous person in any room is always the one everyone thinks is harmless. Sometimes that person is you, and sometimes that's exactly what will save your life. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Thank you for believing that preparation can triumph over predation, that intelligence can defeat malice, and that the underestimated can become unstoppable. And thank you for understanding that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting everything. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like someone was playing a game you didn't know you were in, if you believe that quiet preparation beats loud desperation every single time, then this channel is for you. Subscribe now for more stories of strategic revenge, systematic justice, and the kind of long-term thinking that turns victims into victors. Comment below and tell me, what would you have done differently in my situation? Have you ever had to document someone's attempts to harm you? How do you balance trust with strategic caution in your own relationships? And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's dealing with suspicious family dynamics or feeling like they're being systematically undermined, share this video. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is help others recognize the patterns before it's too late. Remember, you are more capable, more intelligent, and more dangerous than anyone who underestimates you realizes. That's not a threat, that's a promise. Until next time, stay prepared, stay vigilant, and never let anyone convince you that your quiet strength is anything less than your greatest superpower.